This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Stewart Wills. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 8. How long he stood stock still by the hatch, expecting every moment to feel the ship dip under his feet and the rush of water take him at the back and toss him like a chip, I cannot say. Not very long, 2 minutes perhaps. A couple of men he could not make out began to converse drowsily, and also, he could not tell where, he detected a curious noise of shuffling feet. Above these faint sounds there was that awful stillness preceding a catastrophe, that trying silence of the moment before the crash. Then it came into his head that perhaps he would have time to rush along and cut all the lanyards of the gripes, so that the boats would float as the ship went down. The Patna had a long bridge, and all the boats were up there, 4 on one side and 3 on the other, the smallest of them on the port side, and nearly abreast of the steering gear. He assured me, with evident anxiety to be believed, that he had been most careful to keep them ready for instant service. He knew his duty. I dare say he was a good enough mate as far as that went. "I always believed in being prepared for the worst," he commented, staring anxiously in my face. I nodded my approval of the sound principle, averting my eyes before the subtle unsoundness of the man. He started unsteadily to run. He had to step over legs, avoid stumbling against the heads. Suddenly some one caught hold of his coat from below, and a distressed voice spoke under his elbow. The light of the lamp he carried in his right hand fell upon an upturned dark face, whose eyes entreated him together with the voice. He had picked up enough of the language to understand the word water, repeated several times in a tone of insistence, of prayer, almost of despair. He gave a jerk to get away, felt an arm embrace his leg. "The beggar clung to me like a drowning man," he said impressively. "Water! Water! What water did he mean? What did he know?" As calmly as I could I ordered him to let go. He was stopping me. Time was pressing. Other men began to stir. I wanted time, time to cut the boats adrift. He got hold of my hand now, and I felt that he would begin to shout. It flashed upon me it was enough to start a panic, and I hauled off with my free arm and slung the lamp in his face. The glass jingled, the light went out, but the blow made him let go, and I ran off. I wanted to get the boats. I wanted to get at the boats. He leaped after me from behind. I turned on him. He would not keep quiet. He tried to shout. I had half throttled him before I made out what he wanted. He wanted some water. Water to drink. They were on a strict allowance, you know, and he had had with him a young boy I had noticed several times. His child was sick and thirsty. He had caught sight of me as I passed by, and was begging for a little water. That's all. We were under the bridge in the dark. He kept on snatching at my wrists. There was no getting rid of him. I dashed into my berth, grabbed my water bottle, and thrust it into his hands. He vanished. I didn't find out till then how much I was in want of a drink myself. He leaned on one elbow with a hand over his eyes. I felt a creepy sensation all down my backbone. There was something peculiar in all this. The fingers of the hand that shaded his brow trembled slightly. He broke the short silence. "These things happen only once to a man, and ah, well. When I got on the bridge at last the beggars were getting one of the boats off the chocks. A boat! I was running up the ladder when a heavy blow fell on my shoulder, just missing my head. It didn't stop me, and the chief engineer they had got him out of his bunk by then raised the boat stretcher again. Somehow I had no mind to be surprised at anything. All this seemed natural and awful and awful. I dodged that miserable maniac, lifted him off the deck as though he'd been a little child, and he started whispering in my arms, 'Don't, don't, I thought you was one of them niggers.' I flung him away. He skidded along the bridge and knocked the legs from under the little chap, the second. The skipper, busy about the boat, looked round and came at me head down, growling like a wild beast. I flinched no more than a stone. I was as solid standing there as this." He tapped lightly with his knuckles at the wall beside his chair. "It was as though I had heard it all, seen it all, gone through it all 20 times already. I wasn't afraid of them. I drew back my fist, and he stopped short, muttering, 'Ah, it's you. Lend a hand, quick.' That's what he said. Quick. As if anybody could be quick enough. 'Aren't you going to do something?' I asked. 'Yes. Clear out,' he snarled over his shoulder. I don't think I understood then what he meant. The other two had picked themselves up by that time, and they rushed together to the boat. They trampled, they wheezed, they shoved, they cursed the boat, the ship, each other, cursed me, all in mutters. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I watched the slant of the ship. She was as still as if landed on the blocks in a dry dock. Only she was like this." He held up his hand, palm under, tips of the fingers inclined downwards. "Like this," he repeated. "I could see the line of the horizon before me, as clear as a bell, above her stem-head. I could see the water far off there, black and sparkling and still, still as a pond, deadly still, more still than ever a sea was before, more still than I could bear to look at. Have you watched a ship floating head down, checked in sinking by a sheet of old iron too rotten to stand being shored up? Have you? Oh yes, shored up. I thought of that. I thought of every mortal thing. But can you shore up a bulkhead in 5 minutes, or in 50 for that matter? Where was I going to get men that would go down below? And the timber! The timber! Would you have had courage to swing a maul for the first blow if you had seen that bulkhead? Don't say you would. You had not seen it. Nobody would. Hang it! To do a thing like that you must believe there is a chance, 1 in 1,000 at least, some ghost of a chance, and you would not have believed. Nobody would have believed. You think me a cur for standing there, but what would you have done? What? You can't tell. Nobody can tell. One must have the time to turn round. What would you have me do? Where was the kindness in making crazy with fright all those people I could not save single-handed, that nothing could save? Look here, as true as I sit on this chair before you. He drew quick breaths at every few words, and shot quick glances at my face, as though in his anguish he were watchful of the effect. He was not speaking to me, he was only speaking before me, in a dispute with an invisible personality, an antagonistic and inseparable partner of his existence, another possessor of his soul. These were issues beyond the competency of a court of inquiry. It was a subtle and momentous quarrel as to the true essence of life, and did not want a judge. He wanted an ally, a helper, an accomplice. I felt the risk I ran of being circumvented, blinded, decoyed, bullied perhaps into taking a definite part in a dispute impossible of decision if one had to be fair to all the phantoms in possession, to the reputable that had its claims and to the disreputable that had its exigencies. I can't explain to you who haven't seen him and who hear his words only at second hand the mixed nature of my feelings. It seemed to me I was being made to comprehend the inconceivable, and I know of nothing to compare with the discomfort of such a sensation. I was made to look at the convention that lurks in all truths, and on the essential sincerity of falsehood. He appealed to all sides at once, to the side turned perpetually to the light of day, and to that side of us which, like the other hemisphere of the moon, exists stealthily in perpetual darkness, with only a fearful ashy light falling at times on the edge. He swayed me. I own up to it, I own up. The occasion was obscure, insignificant, what you will, a lost youngster, one in a million. But then he was one of us. An incident as completely devoid of importance as the flooding of an ant heap, and yet the mystery of his attitude got hold of me as though he had been an individual in the forefront of his kind, as if the obscure truth involved were momentous enough to affect mankind's conception of itself. Marlow paused to put new life into his expiring cheroot, seemed to forget all about the story, and abruptly began again. My fault, of course. One has no business really to get interested. It's a weakness of mine. His was of another kind. My weakness consists in not having a discriminating eye for the incidental, for the externals, no eye for the hod of the rag picker or the fine linen of the next man. Next man, that's it. I've met so many men, he pursued with momentary sadness. Met them, too, with a certain impact, let us say, like this fellow, for instance. And in each case all I could see was merely the human being, a confounded democratic quality of vision which may be better than total blindness, but has been of no advantage to me, I can assure you. Men expect one to take into account their fine linen, but I never could get up any enthusiasm about these things. Oh, it's a failing. It's a failing. And then comes a soft evening, a lot of men too indolent for whist, and a story. He paused again to wait for an encouraging remark, perhaps, but nobody spoke. Only the host, as if reluctantly performing a duty, murmured, "You are so subtle, Marlow." "Who? I?" said Marlow in a low voice. "Oh no, but he was. And try as I may for the success of this yarn, I am missing innumerable shades. They were so fine, so difficult to render in colourless words. Because he complicated matters by being so simple, too. The simplest, poor devil. By Jove, he was amazing. There he sat, telling me that just as I saw him before my eyes he wouldn't be afraid to face anything, and believing it too. I tell you it was fabulously innocent, and it was enormous, enormous. I watched him covertly, just as though I had suspected him of an intention to take a jolly good rise out of me. He was confident that, on the square, mind, there was nothing he couldn't meet. Ever since he had been so high, quite a little chap, he had been preparing himself for all the difficulties that can beset one on land and water. He confessed proudly to this kind of foresight. He had been elaborating dangers and defences, expecting the worst, rehearsing his best. He must have led a most exalted existence. Can you fancy it? A succession of adventures, so much glory, such a victorious progress, and the deep sense of his sagacity crowning every day of his inner life. He forgot himself, his eyes shone, and with every word my heart, searched by the light of his absurdity, was growing heavier in my breast. I had no mind to laugh, and, lest I should smile, I made for myself a stolid face. He gave signs of irritation. "It is always the unexpected that happens," I said in a propitiatory tone. My obtuseness provoked him into a contemptuous "Pah!" I suppose he meant that the unexpected couldn't touch him. Nothing less than the unconceivable itself could get over his perfect state of preparation. He had been taken unawares, and he whispered to himself a malediction upon the waters and the firmament, upon the ship, upon the men. Everything had betrayed him. He had been tricked into that sort of high-minded resignation which prevented him from lifting as much as his little finger, while these others, who had a very clear perception of the actual necessity, were tumbling against each other and sweating desperately over that boat business. Something had gone wrong there at the last moment. It appears that in their flurry they had contrived in some mysterious way to get the sliding bolt of the foremost boat chock jammed tight, and forthwith had gone out of the remnants of their minds over the deadly nature of that accident. It must have been a pretty sight, the fierce industry of these beggars toiling on a motionless ship that floated quietly in the silence of a world asleep, fighting against time for the freeing of that boat, grovelling on all fours, standing up in despair, tugging, pushing, snarling at each other venomously, ready to kill, ready to weep, and only kept from flying at each other's throats by the fear of death that stood silent behind them like an inflexible and cold-eyed taskmaster. Oh yes, it must have been a pretty sight. He saw it all. He could talk about it with scorn and bitterness. He had a minute knowledge of it by means of some sixth sense, I conclude, because he swore to me he had remained apart, without a glance at them and at the boat, without one single glance. And I believe him. I should think he was too busy watching the threatening slant of the ship, the suspended menace discovered in the midst of the most perfect security, fascinated by the sword hanging by a hair over his imaginative head. Nothing in the world moved before his eyes, and he could depict to himself without hindrance the sudden swing upward of the dark skyline, the sudden tilt up of the vast plain of the sea, the swift still rise, the brutal fling, the grasp of the abyss, the struggle without hope, the starlight closing over his head for ever like the vault of a tomb, the revolt of his young life, the black end. He could. By Jove, who couldn't? And you must remember he was a finished artist in that peculiar way. He was a gifted poor devil with the faculty of swift and forestalling vision. The sights it showed him had turned him into cold stone from the soles of his feet to the nape of his neck. But there was a hot dance of thoughts in his head, a dance of lame, blind, mute thoughts, a whirl of awful cripples. Didn't I tell you he confessed himself before me as though I had the power to bind and to loose? He burrowed deep, deep in the hope of my absolution, which would have been of no good to him. This was one of those cases which no solemn deception can palliate, where no man can help, where his very Maker seems to abandon a sinner to his own devices. He stood on the starboard side of the bridge as far as he could get from the struggle for the boat, which went on with the agitation of madness and the stealthiness of a conspiracy. The two Malays had meantime remained holding to the wheel. Just picture to yourselves the actors in that, thank God, unique episode of the sea. Four beside themselves with fierce and secret exertions, and three looking on in complete immobility over the awnings covering the profound ignorance of hundreds of human beings, with their weariness, with their dreams, with their hopes arrested, held by an invisible hand on the brink of annihilation. For that they were so makes no doubt to me. Given the state of the ship, this was the deadliest possible description of accident that could happen. These beggars by the boat had every reason to go distracted with funk. Frankly, had I been there, I would not have given as much as a counterfeit farthing for the ship's chance to keep above water to the end of each successive second. And still she floated. These sleeping pilgrims were destined to accomplish their whole pilgrimage to the bitterness of some other end. It was as if the omnipotence whose mercy they confessed had needed their humble testimony on earth for a while longer, and had looked down to make a sign, "Thou shalt not," to the ocean. Their escape would trouble me as a prodigiously inexplicable event, did I not know how tough old iron can be. as tough sometimes as the spirit of some men we meet now and then, worn to a shadow and breasting the weight of life. Not the least wonder of these 20 minutes, to my mind, is the behaviour of the two helmsmen. They were amongst the native batch of all sorts brought over from Aden to give evidence at the inquiry. One of them, labouring under intense bashfulness, was very young, and with his smooth, yellow, cheery countenance, looked even younger than he was. I remember perfectly Brierly asking him, through the interpreter, what he thought of it at the time, and the interpreter, after a short colloquy, turning to the court with an important air, "He says he thought nothing." The other, with patient, blinking eyes, a blue cotton handkerchief, faded with much washing, bound with a smart twist over a lot of grey wisps, his face shrunk into grim hollows, his brown skin made darker by a mesh of wrinkles, explained that he had a knowledge of some evil thing befalling the ship, but there had been no order. He could not remember an order. Why should he leave the helm? To some further questions he jerked back his spare shoulders, and declared it never came into his mind then that the white men were about to leave the ship through fear of death. He did not believe it now. There might have been secret reasons. He wagged his old chin knowingly. Aha! Secret reasons. He was a man of great experience, and he wanted that white Tuan to know. He turned towards Brierly, who didn't raise his head, that he had acquired a knowledge of many things by serving white men on the sea for a great number of years, and suddenly, with shaky excitement, he poured upon our spellbound attention a lot of queer-sounding names, names of dead and gone skippers, names of forgotten country ships, names of familiar and distorted sound, as if the hand of dumb time had been at work on them for ages. They stopped him at last. A silence fell upon the court, a silence that remained unbroken for at least a minute, and passed gently into a deep murmur. This episode was the sensation of the second day's proceedings, affecting all the audience, affecting everybody except Jim, who was sitting moodily at the end of the first bench, and never looked up at this extraordinary and damning witness that seemed possessed of some mysterious theory of defence. So these two Lascars stuck to the helm of that ship without steerage way, where death would have found them if such had been their destiny. The whites did not give them half a glance, had probably forgotten their existence. Assuredly Jim did not remember it. He remembered he could do nothing. He could do nothing now he was alone. There was nothing to do but stick with the ship. No use making a disturbance about it. Was there? He waited upstanding, without a sound, stiffened in the idea of some sort of heroic discretion. The first engineer ran cautiously across the bridge to tug at his sleeve. "Come and help! For God's sake, come and help!" He ran back to the boat on the points of his toes, and returned directly to worry at his sleeve, begging and cursing at the same time. "I believe he would have kissed my hands," said Jim savagely, "and next moment he starts foaming and whispering in my face, 'If I had the time, I would like to crack your skull for you.' I pushed him away. Suddenly he caught hold of me round the neck. Damn him! I hit him. I hit out without looking. 'Won't you save your own life, you infernal coward?' he sobs. Coward! He called me an infernal coward! He called me! He had thrown himself back and was shaking with laughter. I had never in my life heard anything so bitter as that noise. It fell like a blight on all the merriment about donkeys, pyramids, bazaars, or what not. Along the whole dim length of the gallery the voices dropped. The pale blotches of faces turned our way with one accord, and the silence became so profound that the clear tinkle of a teaspoon falling on the tessellated floor of the veranda rang out like a tiny and silvery scream. "You mustn't laugh like this, with all these people about," I remonstrated. "It isn't nice for them, you know." He gave no sign of having heard at first, but after a while, with a stare that, missing me altogether, seemed to probe the heart of some awful vision, he muttered carelessly, "Oh, they'll think I am drunk." And after that you would have thought from his appearance he would never make a sound again. But no fear. He could no more stop telling now than he could have stopped living by the mere exertion of his will. End of chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Stewart Wills. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 9. I was saying to myself, "Sink! Curse you, sink!" These were the words with which he began again. He wanted it over. He was severely left alone, and he formulated in his head this address to the ship in a tone of imprecation, while at the same time he enjoyed the privilege of witnessing scenes, as far as I can judge, of low comedy. They were still at that bolt. The skipper was ordering, "Get under and try to lift," and the others naturally shirked. You understand that being squeezed flat under the keel of a boat wasn't a desirable position to be caught in if the ship went down suddenly. "Why don't you the strongest?" whined the little engineer. "Gott verdam! I am too thick," spluttered the skipper in despair. It was funny enough to make angels weep. They stood idle for a moment, and suddenly the chief engineer rushed again at Jim. "Come and help, man! Are you mad to throw your only chance away? Come and help, man! Man! Look there! Look!" At last Jim looked astern, where the other pointed with maniacal insistence. He saw a silent black squall which had eaten up already 1/3 of the sky. You know how these squalls come up there about that time of the year. First you see a darkening of the horizon, no more. Then a cloud rises opaque like a wall. A straight edge of vapour lined with sickly whitish gleams flies up from the southwest, swallowing the stars in whole constellations. Its shadow flies over the waters and confounds the sea and sky into one abyss of obscurity. And all is still. No thunder, no wind, no sound, not a flicker of lightning. Then in the tenebrous immensity a livid arch appears. A swell or two like undulations of the very darkness run past, and suddenly wind and rain strike together with a peculiar impetuosity, as though they had burst through something solid. Such a cloud had come up while they weren't looking. They had just noticed it, and were perfectly justified in surmising that if in absolute stillness there was some chance for the ship to keep afloat a few minutes longer, the least disturbance of the sea would make an end of her instantly. Her first nod to the swell that precedes the burst of such a squall would also be her last, would become a plunge, would, so to speak, be prolonged into a long dive, down, down to the bottom. Hence these new capers of their fright, these new antics in which they displayed their extreme aversion to die. "It was black, black," pursued Jim with moody steadiness. "It had sneaked up upon us from behind. The infernal thing! I suppose there had been at the back of my head some hope yet. I don't know. But that was all over anyhow. It maddened me to see myself caught like this. I was angry as though I had been trapped. I was trapped. The night was hot, too, I remember. Not a breath of air." He remembered so well that, gasping in his chair, he seemed to sweat and choke before my eyes. No doubt it maddened him, it knocked him over afresh, in a manner of speaking.
But it made him also remember that important purpose which had sent him rushing on that bridge only to slip clean out of his mind. He had intended to cut the lifeboats clear of the ship. He whipped out his knife and went to work slashing as though he had seen nothing, had heard nothing, had known of no one on board. They thought him hopelessly wrong-headed and crazy, but dared not protest noisily against this useless loss of time. When he had done he returned to the very same spot from which he had started. The chief was there, ready with a clutch at him, to whisper close to his head, scathingly, as though he wanted to bite his ear. "You silly fool! Do you think you'll get at the ghost of a show when all that lot of brutes is in the water? Why, they will batter your head for you from these boats." He wrung his hands, ignored, at Jim's elbow. The skipper kept up a nervous shuffle in one place and mumbled, "Hammer! Hammer! Mein Gott! Get a hammer!" The little engineer whimpered like a child, but broken arm and all, he turned out the least craven of the lot, as it seems, and actually mustered enough pluck to run an errand to the engine room. No trifle, it must be owned in fairness to him. Jim told me he darted desperate looks like a cornered man, gave one low wail, and dashed off. He was back instantly, clambering, hammer in hand, and without a pause flung himself at the bolt. The others gave Jim up at once and ran off to assist. He heard the tap tap of the hammer, the sound of the released chock falling over. The boat was clear. Only then he turned to look, only then. But he kept his distance, he kept his distance. He wanted me to know he had kept his distance, that there was nothing in common between him and these men who had the hammer. Nothing whatever. It is more than probable he thought himself cut off from them by a space that could not be traversed, by an obstacle that could not be overcome, by a chasm without bottom. He was as far as he could get from them, the whole breadth of the ship. His feet were glued to that remote spot and his eyes to their indistinct group, bowed together and swaying strangely in the common torment of fear. A hand lamp lashed to a stanchion above a little table rigged up on the bridge (the Patna had no chart room amidships) threw a light on their labouring shoulders, on their arched and bobbing backs. They pushed at the bow of the boat, they pushed out into the night, they pushed and would no more look back at him. They had given him up, as if indeed he had been too far, too hopelessly separated from themselves to be worth an appealing word, a glance, or a sign. They had no leisure to look back upon his passive heroism, to feel the sting of his abstention. The boat was heavy. They pushed at the bow with no breath to spare for an encouraging word. But the turmoil of terror that had scattered their self-command like chaff before the wind converted their desperate exertions into a bit of fooling, upon my word, fit for knockabout clowns in a farce. They pushed with their hands, with their heads, they pushed for dear life, with all the weight of their bodies, they pushed with all the might of their souls. Only no sooner had they succeeded in canting the stem clear of the davit than they would leave off like one man and start a wild scramble into her. As a natural consequence the boat would swing in abruptly, driving them back, helpless and jostling against each other. They would stand nonplussed for a while, exchanging in fierce whispers all the infamous names they could call to mind, and go at it again. 3 times this occurred. He described it to me with morose thoughtfulness. He hadn't lost a single movement of that comic business. I loathed them. I hated them. I had to look at all that, he said, without emphasis, turning upon me a sombrely watchful glance. Was there ever any one so shamefully tried? He took his head in his hands for a moment, like a man driven to distraction by some unspeakable outrage. These were things he could not explain to the court, and not even to me, but I would have been little fitted for the reception of his confidences had I not been able at times to understand the pauses between the words. In this assault upon his fortitude there was the jeering intention of a spiteful and vile vengeance. There was an element of burlesque in his ordeal, a degradation of funny grimaces in the approach of death or dishonour. He related facts which I have not forgotten, but at this distance of time I couldn't recall his very words. I only remember that he managed wonderfully to convey the brooding rancour of his mind into the bare recital of events. Twice, he told me, he shut his eyes in the certitude that the end was upon him already, and twice he had to open them again. Each time he noted the darkening of the great stillness. The shadow of the silent cloud had fallen upon the ship from the zenith, and seemed to have extinguished every sound of her teeming life. He could no longer hear the voices under the awnings. He told me that each time he closed his eyes a flash of thought showed him that crowd of bodies laid out for death, as plain as daylight. When he opened them, it was to see the dim struggle of four men fighting like mad with a stubborn boat. They would fall back before it, time after time, stand swearing at each other, and suddenly make another rush in a bunch, enough to make you die laughing, he commented with downcast eyes. Then raising them for a moment to my face with a dismal smile, I ought to have a merry life of it, by God, for I shall see that funny sight a good many times yet before I die. His eyes fell again. See and hear. See and hear, he repeated twice, at long intervals filled by vacant staring. He roused himself. I made up my mind to keep my eyes shut, he said, and I couldn't. I couldn't, and I don't care who knows it. Let them go through that kind of thing before they talk. Just let them, and do better. That's all. The second time my eyelids flew open, and my mouth too. I had felt the ship move. She just dipped her bows and lifted them gently and slow, everlastingly slow, and ever so little. She hadn't done that much for days. The cloud had raced ahead, and this first swell seemed to travel upon a sea of lead. There was no life in that stir. It managed, though, to knock over something in my head. What would you have done? You are sure of yourself, aren't you? What would you do if you felt now, this minute, the house here move, just move a little under your chair? Leap, by heavens! You would take one spring from where you sit and land in that clump of bushes yonder. He flung his arm out at the night beyond the stone balustrade. I held my peace. He looked at me very steadily, very severe. There could be no mistake. I was being bullied now, and it behoved me to make no sign lest by a gesture or a word I should be drawn into a fatal admission about myself which would have had some bearing on the case. I was not disposed to take any risk of that sort. Don't forget I had him before me, and really he was too much like one of us not to be dangerous. But if you want to know, I don't mind telling you that I did, with a rapid glance, estimate the distance to the mass of denser blackness in the middle of the grass plot before the verandah. He exaggerated. I would have landed short by several feet, and that's the only thing of which I am fairly certain. The last moment had come as he thought, and he did not move. His feet remained glued to the planks as if his thoughts were knocking about loose in his head. It was at this moment, too, that he saw one of the men around the boat step backward suddenly, clutch at the air with raised arms, totter, and collapse. He didn't exactly fall. He only slid gently into a sitting posture, all hunched up, and with his shoulders propped against the side of the engine room skylight. That was the donkey man, a haggard, white-faced chap with a ragged moustache. Acted third engineer, he explained. Dead, I said. We had heard something of that in court. So they say. he pronounced with sombre indifference. Of course I never knew. Weak heart. The man had been complaining of being out of sorts for some time before. Excitement, overexertion, devil only knows. It was easy to see he did not want to die either. Droll, isn't it? May I be shot if he hadn't been fooled into killing himself. Fooled! Neither more nor less. Fooled into it, by heavens, just as I. Ah, if he had only kept still. If he had only told them to go to the devil when they came to rush him out of his bunk because the ship was sinking. If he had only stood by with his hands in his pockets and called them names. He got up, shook his fist, glared at me, and sat down. A chance missed, eh? I murmured. Why don't you laugh? He said. A joke hatched in hell. Weak heart. I wish sometimes mine had been. This irritated me. Do you? I exclaimed with deep-rooted irony. Yes. Can't you understand? He cried. I don't know what more you could wish for, I said angrily. He gave me an utterly uncomprehending glance. This shaft had also gone wide of the mark, and he was not the man to bother about stray arrows. Upon my word, he was too unsuspecting. He was not fair game. I was glad that my missile had been thrown away, that he had not even heard the twang of the bow. Of course he could not know at the time the man was dead. The next minute, his last on board, was crowded with a tumult of events and sensations which beat about him like the sea upon a rock. I use the simile advisedly, because from his relation I am forced to believe he had preserved through it all a strange illusion of passiveness, as though he had not acted but had suffered himself to be handled by the infernal powers who had selected him for the victim of their practical joke. The first thing that came to him was the grinding surge of the heavy davits swinging out at last, a jar which seemed to enter his body from the deck through the soles of his feet and travel up his spine to the crown of his head. Then, the squall being very near now, another and a heavier swell lifted the passive hull in a threatening heave that checked his breath, while his brain and his heart together were pierced as with daggers by panic-stricken screams. "Let go! For God's sake, let go! Let go! She's going!" Following upon that, the boat falls ripped through the blocks, and a lot of men began to talk in startled tones under the awnings. When these beggars did break out, their yelps were enough to wake the dead, he said. Next, after the splashing shock of the boat literally dropped in the water, came the hollow noises of stamping and tumbling in her, mingled with confused shouts. "Unhook! Unhook! Shove! Unhook! Shove for your life! Here's the squall down on us!" He heard, high above his head, the faint muttering of the wind. He heard below his feet a cry of pain. A lost voice alongside started cursing a swivel hook. The ship began to buzz fore and aft like a disturbed hive, and as quietly as he was telling me all of this, because just then he was very quiet in attitude, in face, in voice, he went on to say, without the slightest warning, as it were, "I stumbled over his legs." This was the first I heard of his having moved at all. I could not restrain a grunt of surprise. Something had started him off at last. But of the exact moment, of the cause that tore him out of his immobility, he knew no more than the uprooted tree knows of the wind that laid it low. All of this had come to him, the sounds, the sights, the legs of the dead man, by Jove! The infernal joke was being crammed devilishly down his throat. But look you, he was not going to admit any sort of swallowing motion in his gullet. It's extraordinary how he could cast upon you the spirit of his illusion. I listened as if to a tale of black magic at work upon a corpse. He went over sideways, very gently, and this is the last thing I remember seeing on board, he continued. I did not care what he did. It looked as though he were picking himself up. I thought he was picking himself up, of course. I expected him to bolt past me over the rail and drop into the boat after the others. I could hear them knocking about down there, and a voice as if crying up a shaft called out, "George!" Then the three voices together raised a yell. They came to me separately. One bleated, another screamed, one howled. Ugh! He shivered a little, and I beheld him rise slowly, as if a steady hand from above had been pulling him out of the chair by his hair. Up, slowly, to his full height, and when his knees had locked stiff, the hand let him go, and he swayed a little on his feet. There was a suggestion of awful stillness in his face, in his movements, in his very voice, when he said, "They shouted," and involuntarily I pricked up my ears for the ghost of that shout that would be heard directly through the false effect of silence. "There were 800 people in that ship," he said, impaling me to the back of my seat with an awful blank stare. 800 living people, and they were yelling after one dead man to come down and be saved. Jump, George, jump, oh jump. I stood by with my hand on the davit. I was very quiet. It had come over pitch dark. You could see neither sky nor sea. I heard the boat alongside go bump, bump, and not another sound down there for a while, but the ship under me was full of talking noises. Suddenly the skipper howled, "Mein Gott! The squall! The squall! Shove off!" With the first hiss of rain and the first gust of wind they screamed, "Jump, George! We'll catch you! Jump!" The ship began a slow plunge. The rain swept over her like a broken sea. My cap flew off my head. My breath was driven back into my throat. I heard as if I had been on the top of a tower another wild screech, "George! Oh, jump!" She was going down, down, head first under me. He raised his hand deliberately to his face, and made picking motions with his fingers as though he had been bothered with cobwebs, and afterwards he looked into the open palm for quite half a second before he blurted out, "I had jumped." He checked himself, averted his gaze. "It seems," he added. His clear blue eyes turned to me with a piteous stare, and looking at him standing before me, dumbfounded and hurt, I was oppressed by a sad sense of resigned wisdom, mingled with the amused and profound pity of an old man helpless before a childish disaster. "Looks like it," I muttered. "I knew nothing about it till I looked up," he explained hastily. "And that's possible, too. You had to listen to him as you would to a small boy in trouble. He didn't know. It had happened somehow. It would never happen again. He had landed partly on somebody and fallen across a thwart. He felt as though all his ribs on his left side must be broken. Then he rolled over and saw vaguely the ship he had deserted uprising above him, with the red sidelight glowing large in the rain like a fire on the brow of a hill seen through a mist. She seemed higher than a wall. She loomed like a cliff over the boat. I wished I could die, he cried. There was no going back. It was as if I had jumped into a well, into an everlasting deep hole. End of chapter 9.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Stewart Wills. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 10. He locked his fingers together and tore them apart. Nothing could be more true. He had indeed jumped into an everlasting deep hole. He had tumbled from a height he could never scale again. By that time the boat had gone driving forward past the bows. It was too dark just then for them to see each other, and moreover they were blinded and half drowned with rain. He told me it was like being swept by a flood through a cavern. They turned their backs to the squall. The skipper, it seems, got an oar over the stern to keep the boat before it, and for 2 or 3 minutes the end of the world had come through a deluge in a pitchy blackness. The sea hissed like 20,000 kettles. That's his simile, not mine. I fancy there was not much wind after the first gust, and he himself admitted at the inquiry that the sea never got up that night to any extent. He crouched down in the bows and stole a furtive glance back. He saw just one yellow gleam of the masthead light high up and blurred like a lost star ready to dissolve. It terrified me to see it still there, he said. That's what he said. What terrified him was the thought that the drowning was not over yet. No doubt he wanted to be done with that abomination as quickly as possible. Nobody in the boat made a sound. In the dark she seemed to fly, of course, but she could not have had much way. Then the shower swept ahead, and the great distracting hissing noise followed the rain into the distance and died out. There was nothing to be heard but the slight wash about the boat's sides. Somebody's teeth were chattering violently. A hand touched his back. A faint voice said, "You there?" Another cried out shakily, "She's gone!" and they all stood up together to look astern. They saw no bright lights. All was black. A thin cold drizzle was driving into their faces. The boat lurched slightly. The teeth chattered faster, stopped, and began again twice before the man could master his shiver sufficiently to say, "Just in time." He recognized the voice of the chief engineer, saying surlily, "I saw her go down. I happened to turn my head." The wind had dropped almost completely. They watched in the dark with their heads half turned to windward, as if expecting to hear cries. At first he was thankful the night had covered up the scene before his eyes, and then to know of it and yet to have seen or heard nothing appeared somehow the culminating point of an awful misfortune. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured, interrupting himself in his disjointed narrative. It did not seem so strange to me. He must have had an unconscious conviction that the reality could not be half as bad, not half as anguishing, appalling, and vengeful as the created terror of his imagination. I believe that in this first moment his heart was wrung with all the suffering, that his soul knew the accumulated savour of all the fear, all the horror, all the despair of 800 human beings pounced upon in the night by a sudden and violent death. Else why should he have said, "It seemed to me that I must jump out of that accursed boat and swim back to sea, half a mile, more, any distance, to the very spot"? Why this impulse? Do you see the significance? Why back to the very spot? Why not drown alongside, if he meant drowning? Why back to the very spot, to sea, as if his imagination had to be soothed by the assurance that all was over before death could bring relief? I defy any one of you to offer another explanation. It is one of those bizarre and exciting glimpses through the fog. It was an extraordinary disclosure. He let it out as the most natural thing one can say. He fought down that impulse, and then he became conscious of the silence. He mentioned this to me, a silence of the sea, of the sky, merged into one indefinite immensity, still as death around these saved, palpitating lives. "You might have heard a pin drop in that boat," he said, with a queer contraction of his lips, like a man trying to master his sensibilities while relating some extremely moving fact. A silence! God alone, who had willed him as he was, knows what he made of it in his heart. "I didn't think any spot on earth could be so still," he said. "You couldn't distinguish the sea from the sky. There was nothing to see and nothing to hear, not a glimmer, not a shape, not a sound. You could have believed that every bit of dry land had gone to the bottom, that every man on earth but I and these beggars in the boat had got drowned." He leaned over the table with his knuckles propped amongst the coffee cups, liquor glasses, cigar ends. "I seemed to believe it. Everything was gone, and all was over." He fetched a deep sigh. "With me." Marlow sat up abruptly and flung away his cheroot with force. It made a darting red trail like a toy rocket fired through the drapery of creepers. Nobody stirred. "Hey, what do you think of it?" he cried with sudden animation. Wasn't he true to himself? Wasn't he? His saved life was over for want of ground under his feet, for want of sights for his eyes, for want of voices in his ears. Annihilation, eh? And all the time it was only a clouded sky, a sea that did not break, the air that did not stir. Only a night, only a silence. It lasted for a while, and then they were suddenly and unanimously moved to make a noise over their escape. "I knew from the first she would go. Not a minute too soon. A narrow squeak, begosh." He said nothing, but the breeze that had dropped came back, a gentle draught freshened steadily, and the sea joined its murmuring voice to this talkative reaction succeeding the dumb moments of awe. She was gone! She was gone! Not a doubt of it. Nobody could have helped. They repeated the same words over and over again, as though they couldn't stop themselves. Never doubted she would go. The lights were gone. No mistake. The lights were gone. Couldn't expect anything else. She had to go. He noticed that they talked as though they had left behind nothing but an empty ship. They concluded she would not have been long when once she started. It seemed to cause them some sort of satisfaction. They assured each other that she couldn't have been long about it. "Just shot down like a flat iron." The chief engineer declared that the masthead light at the moment of sinking seemed to drop "like a lighted match you throw down." At this the second laughed hysterically. "I'm glad! I'm glad!" His teeth went on "like an electric rattle," said Jim, and all at once he began to cry. He wept and blubbered like a child, catching his breath and sobbing, "Oh dear! Oh dear! Oh dear!" He would be quiet for a while and start suddenly, "Oh, my poor arm! Oh, my poor arm!" I felt I could knock him down. Some of them sat in the stern sheets. I could just make out their shapes. Voices came to me, mumble, mumble, grunt, grunt. All this seemed very hard to bear. I was cold too, and I could do nothing. I thought that if I moved I would have to go over the side and his hand groped steadily, came in contact with a liquor glass, and was withdrawn suddenly, as if it had touched a red hot coal. I pushed the bottle slightly. "Won't you have some more?" I asked. He looked at me angrily. "Don't you think I can tell you what there is to tell without screwing myself up?" he asked. The squad of globe-trotters had gone to bed. We were alone but for a vague white form erect in the shadow that, at being looked at, cringed forward, hesitated, backed away silently. It was getting late, but I did not hurry my guest. In the midst of his forlorn state he heard his companions begin to abuse some one. "What kept you from jumping, you lunatic?" said a scolding voice. The chief engineer left the stern sheets, and could be heard clamouring forward as if with hostile intentions against "the greatest idiot that ever was." The skipper shouted with rasping effort offensive epithets from where he sat at the oar. He lifted his head at that uproar, and heard the name George, while a hand in the dark struck him on the breast. "What have you got to say for yourself, you fool?" queried somebody with a sort of virtuous fury. "They were after me," he said. "They were abusing me by the name of George." He paused to stare, tried to smile, turned his eyes away, and went on. "That little second puts his head right under my nose.
Why, it's that blasted mate."
"What?" howls the skipper from the other end of the boat. "No!" shrieks the chief, and he too stooped to look in my face. The wind had left the boat suddenly. The rain began to fall again, and the soft, uninterrupted, a little mysterious sound with which the sea receives a shower arose on all sides in the night. "They were too taken aback to say anything more at first," he narrated steadily. "And what could I have to say to them?" He faltered for a moment, made an effort to go on. "They called me horrible names." His voice, sinking to a whisper, now and then would leap up suddenly, hardened by the passion of scorn, as though he had been talking of secret abominations. "Never mind what they called me," he said grimly. I could hear hate in their voices. A good thing, too. They could not forgive me for being in that boat. They hated it. It made them mad. He laughed short. But it kept me from... Look, I was sitting with my arms crossed on the gunwale. He perched himself smartly on the edge of the table and crossed his arms. Like this, see? One little tilt backwards and I would have been gone after the others. One little tilt. The least bit. The least bit. He frowned, and tapping his forehead with the tip of his middle finger, "It was there all the time," he said impressively. "All the time. That notion. And the rain, cold, thick, cold as melted snow, colder on my thin cotton clothes. I'll never be so cold again in my life, I know. And the sky was black, too, all black. Not a star, not a light anywhere. Nothing outside that confounded boat, and those two yapping before me like a couple of mean mongrels at a treed thief. Yap! Yap!
'What are you doing here? You're a fine sort. Too much of a bloomin' gentleman to put your hand to it. Come out of a trance, did you? To sneak in, did you?'
Yap! Yap! You ain't fit to live. Yap! Yap! Two of them together trying to outbark each other. The other would bay from the stern through the rain. Couldn't see him. Couldn't make it out. Some of his filthy jargon. Yap! Yap! Bow wow 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 wow! Yap! Yap! It was sweet to hear them. It kept me alive, I tell you. It saved my life. At it they went, as if trying to drive me overboard with the noise.
'I wonder you had pluck enough to jump. You ain't wanted here. If I'd known who it was, I would have tipped you over, you skunk. What have you done with the other? Where did you get the pluck to jump, you coward? What's to prevent us three from firing you overboard?'
They were out of breath. The shower passed away upon the sea. Then nothing. There was nothing round the boat. Not even a sound. Wanted to see me overboard, did they? Upon my soul. I think they would have had their wish if they had only kept quiet. Fire me overboard, would they? Try, I said. I would for a twopence. Too good for you, they screeched together. It was so dark that it was only when one or the other of them moved that I was quite sure of seeing him. By heavens, I only wish they'd tried. I couldn't help exclaiming, "What an extraordinary affair!" "Not bad, eh?" he said, as if in some sort astounded. They pretended to think I had done away with that donkey man for some reason or other. Why should I? And how the devil was I to know? Didn't I get somehow into that boat? Into that boat? I... The muscles round his lips contracted into an unconscious grimace that tore through the mask of his usual expression, something violent, short-lived and illuminating, like a twist of lightning, that admits the eye for an instant into the secret convolutions of a cloud. I did. I was plainly there with them, wasn't I? Isn't it awful a man should be driven to do a thing like that, and be responsible? What did I know about their George they were howling after? I remembered I had seen him curled up on the deck. Murdering coward, the chief kept on calling me. He didn't seem able to remember any other two words. I didn't care, only his noise began to worry me. Shut up, I said. At that he collected himself for a confounded screech. You killed him! You killed him! No, I shouted, but I will kill you directly. I jumped up, and he fell backwards over a thwart with an awful loud thump. I don't know why. Too tired. Tried to step back, I suppose. I stood still, facing aft, and the wretched little second began to whine.
You ain't going to hit a chap with a broken arm, and you call yourself a gentleman too?
I heard a heavy tramp, 1, 2, and wheezy grunting. The other beast was coming at me, clattering his oar over the stern. I saw him moving, big, big, as you see a man in a mist, in a dream. Come on, I cried. I would have tumbled him over like a bale of shakings. He stopped, muttered to himself, and went back. Perhaps he had heard the wind. I didn't. It was the last heavy gust we had. He went back to his oar. I was sorry. I would have tried to. He opened and closed his curved fingers, and his hands had an eager and cruel flutter. Steady, steady, I murmured. What? I'm not excited, he remonstrated, awfully hurt, and with a convulsive jerk of his elbow knocked over the cognac bottle. I started forward, scraping my chair. He bounced off the table as if a mine had been exploded behind his back, and half turned before he alighted, crouching on his feet to show me a startled pair of eyes and a face white about the nostrils. A look of intense annoyance succeeded. Awfully sorry. How clumsy of me, he mumbled, very vexed, while the pungent odour of spilt alcohol enveloped us suddenly with an atmosphere of a low drinking bout in the cool, pure darkness of the night. The lights had been put out in the dining hall. Our candle glimmered solitary in the long gallery, and the columns had turned black from pediment to capital. On the vivid stars the high corner of the harbour office stood out distinct across the esplanade, as though the sombre pile had glided nearer to see and hear. He assumed an air of indifference. I dare say I am less calm now than I was then. I was ready for anything. These were trifles. You had a lively time of it in that boat, I remarked. I was ready, he repeated. After the ship's lights had gone, anything might have happened in that boat, anything in the world, and the world no wiser. I felt this, and I was pleased. It was just dark enough, too. We were like men walled up quick in a roomy grave, no concern with anything on earth. Nobody to pass an opinion, nothing mattered. For the third time during this conversation he laughed harshly, but there was no one about to suspect him of being only drunk. No fear, no laws, no sounds, no eyes, not even our own, till sunrise at least. I was struck by the suggestive truth of his words. There is something peculiar in a small boat upon the wide sea. Over the lives born from under the shadow of death there seems to fall the shadow of madness. When your ship fails you, your whole world seems to fail you. The world that made you, restrained you, took care of you. It is as if the souls of men floating on an abyss and in touch with immensity had been set free for any excess of heroism, absurdity, or abomination. Of course, as with belief, thought, love, hate, conviction, or even the visual aspect of material things, there are as many shipwrecks as there are men. And in this one there was something abject which made the isolation more complete. There was a villainy of circumstances that cut these men off more completely from the rest of mankind, whose ideal of conduct had never undergone the trial of a fiendish and appalling joke. They were exasperated with him for being a half-hearted shirker. He focused on them his hatred of the whole thing. He would have liked to take a signal revenge for the abhorrent opportunity they had put in his way. Trust a boat on the high seas to bring out the irrational that lurks at the bottom of every thought, sentiment, sensation, emotion. It was part of the burlesque meanness pervading that particular disaster at sea that they did not come to blows. It was all threats, all a terribly effective feint, a sham from beginning to end, planned by the tremendous disdain of dark powers whose real terrors always on the verge of triumph, are perpetually foiled by the steadfastness of men. I asked, after waiting for a while, "Well, what happened?" A futile question. I knew too much already to hope for the grace of a single uplifting touch, for the favour of hinted madness, of shadowed horror. "Nothing," he said. "I meant business, but they meant noise only. Nothing happened." And the rising sun found him just as he had jumped up first in the bows of the boat. What a persistence of readiness! He had been holding the tiller in his hand, too, all the night. They had dropped the rudder overboard while attempting to ship it, and I suppose the tiller got kicked forward somehow while they were rushing up and down that boat, trying to do all sorts of things at once, so as to get clear of the side. It was a long, heavy piece of hard wood, and apparently he had been clutching it for 6 hours or so, if you don't call that being ready. Can you imagine him, silent and on his feet half the night, his face to the gusts of rain, staring at sombre forms watchful of vague movements, straining his ears to catch rare low murmurs in the stern sheets? Firmness of courage or effort of fear? What do you think? And the endurance is undeniable too. 6 hours more or less on the defensive. 6 hours of alert mobility while the boat drove slowly or floated, arrested, according to the caprice of the wind, while the sea, calmed, slept at last, while the clouds passed above his head, while the sky, from an immensity lustreless and black, diminished to a sombre and lustrous vault, scintillated with a greater brilliance, faded to the east, paled at the zenith, while the dark shapes blotting the low stars astern got outlines, relief became shoulders, heads, faces, features, confronted him with dreary stares, had dishevelled hair, torn clothes, blinked red eyelids at the white dawn. They looked as though they'd been knocking about drunk in gutters for a week, he described graphically, and then he muttered something about the sunrise being of a kind that foretells a calm day. You know that sailor habit of referring to the weather in every connection. And on my side his few mumbled words were enough to make me see the lower limb of the sun clearing the line of the horizon, the tremble of a vast ripple running over all the visible expanse of the sea, as if the waters had shuddered, giving birth to the globe of light, while the last puff of the breeze would stir the air with a sigh of relief. They sat in the stern, shoulder to shoulder, with the skipper in the middle, like 3 dirty owls, and stared at me. I heard him say, with an intention of hate that distilled a corrosive virtue into the commonplace words, like a drop of powerful poison falling into a glass of water. But my thoughts dwelled upon that sunrise. I could imagine under the pellucid emptiness of the sky these 4 men imprisoned in the solitude of the sea, the lonely sun, regardless of the speck of life, ascending the clear curve of the heaven as if to gaze ardently from a greater height at his own splendour reflected in the still ocean. "They called out to me from aft," said Jim, "as though we had been chums together. I heard them. They were begging me to be sensible and drop that bloomin' piece of wood. Why would I carry on so? They hadn't done me any harm, had they? There had been no harm. No harm." His face crimsoned as though he could not get rid of the air in his lungs. "No harm!" he burst out. "I leave it to you. Can you understand? Can't you? You see it, don't you? No harm! Good God! What more could they have done? Oh yes, I know very well. I jumped. Certainly I jumped. I told you I jumped. But I tell you they were too much for any man. It was their doing as plainly as if they had reached up with a boat hook and pulled me over. Can't you see it? You must see it. Come, speak, straight out." His uneasy eyes fastened upon mine, questioned, begged, challenged, entreated. For the life of me I couldn't help murmuring, "You've been tried. More than is fair," he caught up swiftly. "I wasn't given half a chance with a gang like that. And now they were friendly. Oh, so damnably friendly. Chums, shipmates, all in the same boat. Make the best of it. They hadn't meant anything. They didn't care a hang for George. George had gone back to his berth for something at the last moment and got caught. The man was a manifest fool. Very sad, of course. Their eyes looked at me, their lips moved, they wagged their heads at the other end of the boat. 3 of them, they beckoned to me. Why not? Hadn't I jumped? I said nothing. There are no words for the sort of things I wanted to say. Had I opened my lips just then, I would have simply howled like an animal. I was asking myself when I would wake up. They urged me aloud to come aft and hear quietly what the skipper had to say. We were sure to be picked up before the evening, right in the track of all the canal traffic. There was smoke to the northwest now. It gave me an awful shock to see this faint, faint blur, this low trail of brown mist through which you could see the boundary of sea and sky. I called out to them that I could hear very well where I was. The skipper started swearing as hoarse as a crow. He wasn't going to talk at the top of his voice for my accommodation. Are you afraid they will hear you on shore? I asked. He glared as if he would have liked to claw me to pieces. The chief engineer advised him to humour me. He said I wasn't in my right head yet. The other rose astern like a thick pillar of flesh, and talked. Jim remained thoughtful. Well, I said. What did I care what story they agreed to make up? He cried recklessly. They could tell what jolly well they liked. It was their business. I knew the story. Nothing they could make people believe could alter it for me. I let him talk, argue. He went on and on and on. Suddenly I felt my legs give way under me. I was sick, tired to death. I let fall the tiller, turned my back on them, and sat down on the foremost thwart. I had enough. They called to me to know if I understood. Wasn't it true, every word of it? It was true, by God, after their fashion. I did not turn my head. I heard them palavering together. The silly ass won't say anything. Oh, he understands well enough. Let him be. He will be all right. What can he do? What could I do? Weren't we all in the same boat? I tried to be deaf. The smoke had disappeared to the northward. It was dead calm. They had a drink from the water breaker, and I drank too. Afterward they made a great business of spreading the boat sail over the gunwales. Would I keep a lookout? They crept under, out of my sight, thank God. I felt weary, done up, as if I hadn't had 1 hour's sleep since the day I was born. I couldn't see the water for the glitter of the sunshine. From time to time one of them would creep out, stand up to take a look all round, and get under again. I could hear spells of snoring below the sail. Some of them could sleep. One of them at least. I couldn't. All was light, and the boat seemed to be falling through it. Now and then I would feel quite surprised to find myself sitting on a thwart. He began to walk with measured steps to and fro before my chair, one hand in his trousers pocket, his head bent thoughtfully, and his right arm at long intervals raised for a gesture that seemed to put out of his way an invisible intruder. "I suppose you think I was going mad," he began in a changed tone. "And well you may, if you remember I had lost my cap. The sun crept all the way from east to west over my bare head. But that day I could not come to any harm, I suppose. The sun could not make me mad." His right arm put aside the idea of madness. "Neither could it kill me." Again the arm repulsed a shadow. "That rested with me." "Did it?" I said, inexpressibly amazed at this new turn; and I looked at him with the same sort of feeling I might be fairly conceived to experience had he, after spinning round on his heel, presented an altogether new face. "I didn't get brain fever. I did not drop dead either," he went on. "I didn't bother myself at all about the sun over my head. I was thinking as coolly as any man that ever sat thinking in the shade. That greasy beast of a skipper poked his big cropped head from under the canvas and screwed his fishy eyes up at me. Donnerwetter, you will die, he growled, and drew in like a turtle. I had seen him, I had heard him. He didn't interrupt me. I was thinking just then that I wouldn't. He tried to sound my thought with an attentive glance dropped on me in passing. "Do you mean to say you had been deliberating with yourself whether you would die?" I asked, in as impenetrable a tone as I could command. He nodded without stopping. "Yes, it had come to that as I sat there alone," he said. He passed on a few steps to the imaginary end of his beat, and when he flung round to come back both his hands were thrust deep into his pockets. He stopped short in front of my chair and looked down. "Don't you believe it?" he inquired with tense curiosity. I was moved to make the solemn declaration of my readiness to believe implicitly anything he thought fit to tell me. End of chapter 10.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Stewart Wills. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 11. He heard me out with his head on one side, and I had another glimpse through a rent in the mist in which he moved and had his being. The dim candle spluttered within the ball of glass, and that was all I had to see him by. At his back was the dark night with the clear stars, whose distant glitter, disposed in retreating planes, lured the eye into the depths of a greater darkness. And yet a mysterious light seemed to show me his boyish head, as if in that moment the youth within him had, for a moment, glowed and expired. "You are an awful good sort to listen like this," he said. "It does me good. You don't know what it is to me. You don't. Words seemed to fail him. It was a distinct glimpse. He was a youngster of the sort you like to see about you, of the sort you like to imagine yourself to have been, of the sort whose appearance claims the fellowship of these illusions you had thought gone out, extinct, cold, and which, as if rekindled at the approach of another flame, give a flutter deep, deep down somewhere, give a flutter of light, of heat. Yes, I had a glimpse of him then, and it was not the last of its kind. You don't know what it is for a fellow in my position to be believed. Make a clean breast of it to an elder man. It is so difficult, so awfully unfair, so hard to understand." The mists were closing again. I don't know how old I appeared to him, and how much wise. Not half as old as I felt just then, not half as uselessly wise as I knew myself to be. Surely in no other craft, as in that of the sea, do the hearts of those already launched to sink or swim go out so much to the youth on the brink, looking with shining eyes upon that glitter of the vast surface which is only a reflection of his own glances full of fire. There is such a magnificent vagueness in the expectations that had driven each of us to the sea, such a glorious indefiniteness, such a beautiful greed of adventures that are their own and only reward. What we get, well, we won't talk of that. But can one of us restrain a smile? In no other kind of life is the illusion more wide of reality. In no other is the beginning all illusion, the disenchantment more swift, the subjugation more complete. Hadn't we all commenced with the same desire, ended with the same knowledge, carried the memory of the same cherished glamour through the sordid days of imprecation? What wonder that when some heavy prod gets home the bond is found to be close, that besides the fellowship of the craft there is felt the strength of a wider feeling, the feeling that binds a man to a child. He was there before me, believing that age and wisdom can find a remedy against the pain of truth, giving me a glimpse of himself as a young fellow in a scrape that is the very devil of a scrape, the sort of scrape greybeards wag at solemnly while they hide a smile. And he had been deliberating upon death, confound him. He had found that to meditate about, because he thought he had saved his life, while all its glamour had gone with the ship in the night. What more natural? It was tragic enough and funny enough in all conscience to call aloud for compassion, and in what was I better than the rest of us to refuse him my pity? And even as I looked at him the mists rolled into the rent, and his voice spoke. I was so lost, you know. It was the sort of thing one does not expect to happen to one. It was not like a fight, for instance. It was not, I admitted. He appeared changed, as if he had suddenly matured. One couldn't be sure, he muttered. Ah, you were not sure, I said, and was placated by the sound of a faint sigh that passed between us like the flight of a bird in the night. Well, I wasn't, he said courageously. It was something like that wretched story they made up. It was not a lie, but it wasn't truth all the same. It was something. One knows a downright lie. There was not the thickness of a sheet of paper between the right and the wrong of this affair. How much more did you want? I asked, but I think I spoke so low that he did not catch what I said. He had advanced his argument as though life had been a network of paths separated by chasms. His voice sounded reasonable. Suppose I had not. I mean to say, suppose I had stuck to the ship. Well, how much longer? Say a minute, half a minute. Come, in 30 seconds, as it seemed certain then, I would have been overboard. And do you think I would not have laid hold of the first thing that came in my way? Oar, life-buoy, grating, anything? Wouldn't you? And be saved, I interjected. I would have meant to be, he retorted. And that's more than I meant when I... He shivered as if about to swallow some nauseous drug. Jumped, he pronounced with a convulsive effort whose stress, as if propagated by the waves of the air, made my body stir a little in the chair. He fixed me with lowering eyes. Don't you believe me? He cried. I swear. Confound it. You got me here to talk, and you must. You said you would believe. Of course I do, I protested, in a matter-of-fact tone which produced a calming effect. Forgive me, he said. Of course I wouldn't have talked to you about this if you had not been a gentleman. I ought to have known. I am a gentleman too. Yes, yes, I said hastily. He was looking me squarely in the face and withdrew his gaze slowly. Now you understand why I didn't, after all, didn't go out in that way. I wasn't going to be frightened at what I had done. And anyhow, if I had stuck to the ship, I would have done my best to be saved. Men have been known to float for hours in the open sea, and be picked up not much the worse for it. I might have lasted it out better than many others. There's nothing the matter with my heart. He withdrew his right fist from his pocket, and the blow he struck on his chest resounded like a muffled detonation in the night. No, I said. He meditated with his legs slightly apart and his chin sunk. A hair's breadth, he muttered. Not the breadth of a hair between this and that. And at the time. It is difficult to see a hair at midnight, I put in, a little viciously, I fear. Don't you see what I mean by the solidarity of the craft? I was aggrieved against him as though he had cheated me of a splendid opportunity to keep up the illusion of my beginnings, as though he had robbed our common life of the last spark of its glamour. And so you cleared out at once. Jumped, he corrected me incisively. Jumped, mind, he repeated. And I wondered at the evident but obscure intention. Well, yes. Perhaps I could not see then, but I had plenty of time and any amount of light in that boat. And I could think too. Nobody would know, of course, but This did not make it any easier for me. You've got to believe that, too. I did not want all this talk. No. Yes. I won't lie. I wanted it. It is the very thing I wanted. There. Do you think you or anybody could have made me if I am not afraid to tell. And I wasn't afraid to think either. I looked it in the face. I wasn't going to run away. At first, at night, if it hadn't been for those fellows, I might have... No, by heavens! I was not going to give them that satisfaction. They had done enough. They made up a story, and believed it for all I know. But I knew the truth, and I would live it down, alone, with myself. I wasn't going to give in to such a beastly unfair thing. What did it prove, after all? I was confoundedly cut up, sick of life, to tell you the truth, but what would have been the good to shirk it in that way? That was not the way. I believe it would have ended nothing. He had been walking up and down, but with the last word he turned short at me. "What do you believe?" he asked with violence. A pause ensued, and suddenly I felt myself overcome by a profound and hopeless fatigue, as though his voice had startled me out of a dream of wandering through empty spaces whose immensity had harassed my soul and exhausted my body. "Would have ended nothing," he muttered over me obstinately after a little while. "No, the proper thing was to face it out, alone for myself. Wait for another chance. Find out." End of chapter 11.